September 2025 in Beijing, China parades its military might. The People's Liberation Army, 2 million strong, serving China's Communist Party and its supreme leader, Xi Jinping.
同志们辛苦了。中华民族是不畏强暴、自立自强的伟大民族。
The world was transfixed by the sight of Xi with Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, seen together for the first time. The strongmen of Eurasia, closing ranks against the West. But for those who knew where to look, the most telling signals came from down in the parade. Crossing Tiananmen Square was something never seen before, a complete nuclear arsenal, China's triad.
This was them for the first time publicly showing off a nuclear triad capability to deploy nuclear weapons from land, sea, and air.
It was a bold display of something that had been hidden, a dramatic breakout in China's nuclear forces.
We are really in the middle of a historical nuclear expansion.
China is still well behind the US and Russia in overall numbers, but this expansion is happening so fast that the balance is radically shifting. And it's been obscured by secrecy, never clearly explained by Beijing. The man at the center of this story has enormous power but is himself little understood. He's never publicly challenged. He's not subject to scrutiny by the Chinese people. He's even purged his top military leadership without having to explain why. So in this video, we set out to get as close as we can to Xi Jinping's motives. Why is he pushing this so fast? What does he want to achieve?
He has this paranoia that there might be an eventual showdown with the US-led Western countries.
We have to be prepared, for the worst scenario.
In part 1, we track China's nuclear program from the beginnings to the breakout. It started out as a minimal force. Now it's sending shockwaves through Washington.
The Pentagon projects that China will have 1,500 nuclear weapons by 2035.
China now has more ICBM launchers than the United States. China has outpaced every previous estimate that we've made.
We unpack possible military motivations.
A perception that you could be checkmated in the event of a crisis, that your nuclear deterrent could be taken out of the equation.
And we track how Xi Jinping drove this breakout, the thinking, the power plays, and how Russia was an inspiration.
He pointed to Russia example. Russia made one right decision. That was to maintain its large nuclear arsenal.
In part 2, we examine the nuclear forces that China has developed.
Across the board, they have one of the most advanced missile arsenals in the world, conventional and nuclear.
We explore the geographic constraints that shape Beijing's decisions.
China is fenced in, you could say. It's the Chinese strategists call it a semi-encirclement.
And we dig into the dangers in some of the choices China has made. In part 3, we unpack Beijing's nuclear doctrine, its philosophy of nuclear weapons. Can the world believe China's promise that it would never use a nuclear weapon first?
These are declaratory statements. These are not verifiable.
We consider how Xi might learn from Vladimir Putin's playbook by using nuclear threats.
Russia's world threats about using nuclear warheads have actually worked.
What China is doing here is it wants the ability to nuke the United States a lot, not just a little bit, to try to use nuclear threats to deter the United States from intervening in a Taiwan scenario.
And we see signs that Beijing is preparing to go beyond nuclear threats and be ready to fight a nuclear war.
It's thinking much more about this contingency, that it's trying to match the United States in a limited nuclear war.
If a limited nuclear war sounds to you like a contradiction in terms, you're not alone. But if China's thinking about it, we all need to pay attention. So let's get started. buckle up for the anthem of the rocket force. The rocket force handles China's huge array of land-based missiles, both conventional and nuclear. It's a creation of Xi Jinping. At the end of 2015, Xi elevated a lower-ranking unit to a full military service, with the same stature as the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. This was a key moment in Xi's early years in power, a strong signal that he was getting serious about nuclear weapons. Back in the 1950s, Mao Zedong had begun China's program with technological help from his Soviet counterpart Nikita Khrushchev. They soon fell out, but China went ahead with its first nuclear test in 1964. Beijing was now a member of the nuclear club, but it never joined the Cold War arms race. And from Mao all the way through to Hu Jintao in the 2000s, China's stockpile remained well under 300 warheads, a tiny fraction of US and Soviet and then Russian levels. But as Xi rose to power in 2012, he brought a shift in thinking.
Shortly after he taking power, he gave a speech to military officials at the Second Artillery, which was the former name of the Chinese missile force.
Zhao Tong follows China's nuclear program from Washington, D.C.
So in that speech, he was reported to say that we need to develop strategic capabilities that make enemies worry.
Why would Xi Jinping want to make his enemies worry at this stage? The world in the early 2010s was a much more harmonious place after all, and China was very much on the rise. Its economy was transforming fast, and despite some irritants, relations with the West were far better than they are now. But Xi was thinking ahead, convinced that this relative harmony would not last.
He anticipated that China-US and China-West relations would face growing troubles because of the changing balance of power. So that's aligned with structural realist thinking.
And this structural realist thinking, a belief that states competing for power is what governs everything in global affairs, this guided Xi's strategy.
The solution, according to this view, is that China should further demonstrate its power and to convince the Western powers that China has already risen to a similar level, to compel them to drop their perceived strategy to contain China. So the nuclear buildup is really part of China's comprehensive military buildup that is fully aligned with this line of thinking.
Sure enough, this has been part of a much broader military expansion.
The Chinese military modernization is an across-the-board effort.
Sarah Kirchberger studies China's military from a security institute in northern Germany.
It is really almost without a historic comparable case. You have maybe Kaiser Wilhelm II's naval buildup to match the naval buildup of China with. But this overall effort that goes into the Air Force, the Rocket Force, the Navy, the Army, and every other field, including the nuclear deterrent, is just vast and multifaceted.
Xi Jinping's burgeoning relationship with Vladimir Putin may have influenced his thinking on the unique role of nuclear weapons. Putin too was destined for a clash with the West, and Xi saw lessons to be learned.
He pointed to the Russia example by saying that, look at Russia. Its economy was in real troubles after the end of the Cold War, but Russia made one right decision. That was to maintain its large nuclear arsenal. So the implication is he believed that by having a larger nuclear arsenal, countries could compel their rivals to soften policies across the board.
As Xi solidified his hold on power through the 2010s, his views percolated through the Chinese system.
When people at the operational level became aware of his interest in strengthening military power, including nuclear power, they increasingly submitted internal policy memos calling for exactly that policy. So it became a mutually reinforcing process.
And this channeling of Xi's thinking has had dramatic results in the raw numbers.
For decades, China maintained an arsenal of about 200 nuclear weapons. But in the past few years, China managed to increase that number to more than 600 today. So we are really in the middle of a historical nuclear expansion.
There was also a military logic to Xi's thinking, that a relatively small nuclear arsenal could be vulnerable to being wiped out in a preemptive attack before China could even use it.
That could basically give you a perception that you could be checkmated in the event of a crisis, that your nuclear deterrent could be taken out of the equation at the beginning of a conflict and render you vulnerable. And this is behind a lot of the effort that China is putting, this fear is behind of a lot of the effort that China is putting into the development of its nuclear forces.
In the jargon, that meant that China's force needed to be survivable. Ideally, that would mean having plenty of nuclear-armed submarines at sea. But here China has constraints that the US doesn't face.
China has somewhat of an unfortunate maritime geography from a military strategic viewpoint, because the Chinese coastline is not offering China direct access to the ocean.
That's a problem that takes a lot of time and money to try to work around, and we'll have more on that in part 2. First and foremost, Beijing decided to play to its strengths.
China knew it has this unique advantage of completing large-scale infrastructure projects in a short time and at a lower cost compared with other countries.
And in 2021, the first results became visible to the outside world. US researchers scouring satellite footage of remote parts of Western China identified fields of silos under construction for intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. We spoke to a member of the team back in 2023.
We had seen some construction of a limited number of silos at a concepts of operations site at a place called Jilantai. A silo is effectively a large reinforced hole in the ground that you can launch a missile out of. And so we decided we were going to go basically look for to see if they had built up significant numbers of those patterns of silos. And we finally came across the ones near a place called Yumet, where they're building about 120 solid fuel missile silos.
If you'd like to see that full story on the discovery of the silos, we'll link to it in the notes below this video. It turned out that there were more than 300 in total across separate fields. And while Beijing has never acknowledged building them, it even claimed that they were for wind turbines. For Jiao Tong, their visibility to satellites is actually part of the point.
The quickest way for China to grow its arsenal and demonstrate its nuclear capability to the United States, compared with building nuclear submarines or road mobile ICBM systems, those would take much longer time.
And this certainly has caught the United States' attention, featuring heavily in Senate hearings.
China now has more ICBM launchers than the United States and is expected at least to triple its stockpile by 2035. I would also note that China has outpaced every previous estimate that we've made.
Over in Beijing, the government put out some hints of its plans in late 2025. A white paper asserted that nuclear forces would remain at the minimum level required for national security, without defining what that minimum would be. And the Communist Party's 5-year plan also touches on nuclear weapons. Zhou Bo is a retired senior colonel of the People's Liberation Army.
In the latest 15th 5-year plan, actually the Chinese government has made it clear that we have to enhance the force of strategic deterrence and to maintain the strategic equilibrium and stability in the world. I think what has been showcased in Tiananmen Square demonstrate how we actually have been moving in this direction. That means two things. One is we have to increase our nuclear arsenal. The second thing is we probably will play a bigger role in maintaining the global strategic balance. So that seems to be a big change even for an insider like me.
This idea of global strategic balance might suggest that China wants to achieve nuclear parity with the United States, but nobody knows if that is the goal, and we're not likely to get clarity from Beijing.
Chinese government or the PLA would never disclose how many nuclear warheads we're having.
But it seems clear Xi Jinping wants to be ready for an extremely serious conflict.
He repeatedly called for Chinese party cadres to prepare for the worst-case scenarios, the so-called bottom line thinking. I think he has this paranoia that there might be an eventual showdown with US-led Western countries because of his belief in the structural change driving international relations. And in the worst-case scenario of a major military conflict, a larger nuclear arsenal is the ultimate guarantee that if Western countries lose a conventional war, they wouldn't dare to escalate the conflict to the nuclear level.
We'll dive into some scenarios in part 3, but first, let's find out what is actually in Xi Jinping's growing nuclear arsenal. As we'll see, not all nuclear weapons are the same. We're back at the Beijing parade. And here it is, China's nuclear triad. Missiles that can be launched from the air, land and sea. On show in its entirety for the first time. A triad provides 3 ways to launch nuclear missiles. On land, from underground silos or mobile trucks. At sea, from submarines. And from the air, from bomber aircraft. Missiles are tailored to each of these launch systems. Up front, the triad's newest leg, an air-launched ballistic missile called the Jinglei-1, rumoured but never shown before. Brian Hart is based at the CSIS think tank in Washington, D.C., which closely tracks China's missile programs.
China has historically had this land-based forces and increasingly naval forces that carry nuclear weapons as well. But with the addition of the JL-1, China now has a credible air-based deterrent as well.
Next in the parade, the Zhulang-3, an intercontinental ballistic missile from the sea leg of the triad.
And those nuclear submarines are now being armed with the newest variant of China's submarine-launched ballistic missile, which is the JL-3.
What's new with the JL-3? It has significantly longer range than its predecessors. This directly addresses China's constraints in terms of ocean access we heard about just earlier. Just look at how hemmed in it is by countries that are watching and listening.
There's the first island chain in front of it towards the east, and all of these countries that inhabit the first island chain are all allied with the United States. South Korea, Japan, certainly Taiwan and Philippines, they of course feel that China is their main military competitor or even threat. And they have taken massive precautions, installed listening equipment and all kinds of monitoring devices. So for the Chinese Navy, passing through the gaps in the first island chain means that these naval vessels will always be detected.
This is one major military reason why China wants control of Taiwan, because it would provide direct access to the Pacific Ocean, undetected by anyone.
Military strategists in China say that without control over Taiwan, we will never be an actual superpower.
So for now, China's submarines need to remain within the first island chain to be sure they'll stay undetected. And here their options are limited.
China has basically settled upon the fact that the only sea area that is directly accessible from the Chinese mainland itself, that is deep enough to actually have these submarines operate safely and hide, and is large enough for them to hide in, that's the South China Sea. Because the sea areas to the north of the South China Sea that China is directly accessing, basically the Bohai, the Yellow Sea, and then the East China Sea, they are not deep enough really for ballistic missile submarines to safely operate and hide within. So the South China Sea is the only good option, and it's logical that China has chosen the island of Hainan in the northern part of the South China Sea to become the location for the ballistic missile submarines. From there, they can directly launch, actually from tunnels drilled into the rock below the surface of the sea even.
So what does all this have to do with the JL-3 missile? Well, the Pentagon estimates its range at over 10,000 kilometers, just enough to target the US West Coast from the South China Sea. But Brian Hart emphasizes China is still behind here.
I think that that's still a little bit of a stretch. I think China might need to be really confident that those weapons are going to hit the continental United States. They may have to launch from a bit farther out into the Pacific. So China still has more limited range on those submarine launched missiles than something like what the United States has on its nuclear submarines. But I think that this is still a big advance for China's naval nuclear capabilities.
And the US Navy says Beijing is working fast to close the gap.
Through massive infrastructure investments at several of its primary shipyards, China has more than doubled its submarine construction capability, setting up for sustained submarine growth through the 2030s and beyond.
The JL-3 is also China's latest missile thought to carry multiple warheads.
Multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, or MIRVs, are essentially when you can put multiple typically smaller warheads on one missile. And there's a couple of reasons you may want to do that. First is that it just allows you to hit more targets with one missile. Another key component of MIRVs too is they are more effective at overcoming missile defenses. So if you have more warheads being thrown at an adversary, that adversary is going to have a harder time hitting all of those targets that are coming at once with their missile defenses.
Next up, several new land-based ICBMs. There were some surprises here with a missile that few were expecting.
We certainly have a new kind of ICBM that is called the Dongfeng 61, which was never talked about or even heard of.
So the DF-61 was, I would say, the biggest surprise of the military parade. It was the one that had not been reported on or tracked at all, to my knowledge, before the parade.
Right behind it, another new missile, one that is thought to answer a question. What would the rocket force put in all those new silos we heard about earlier?
The 31BJ is largely believed to be an important part of that expansion of the silo-based capability.
And bringing up the rear, the heavyweight, the DF-5C, a new version of an older giant missile.
The DF-5 is one of China's earliest ICBM capabilities. They're very large silo-based ICBMs. So the DF-5C is the newest variant of that.
In fact, this missile is so big that they parade it in 3 sections. The nose cone is thought to carry up to 10 warheads.
These are immensely powerful weapons.
It adds up to a formidable triad, catching up with the model long used by the US and Russia.
We are proud to have this, for the first time, this kind of triad system, this kind of a nuclear deterrence looks more credible.
And who is meant to be deterred by all this? All the land-based ICBMs we've just seen have ranges well over 10,000 kilometers, more than enough to hit the United States mainland. But here's the thing, these long-range missiles are only part of the picture. In fact, they may not even be the biggest worry.
2 types of Chinese nuclear weapons cause me concern.
Matthew Kronig is a strategy specialist who served on a congressional commission on nuclear weapons.
One, they're engaging in this massive buildup of their strategic nuclear forces. These are the long-range missiles that could hold the continental United States at risk. But then second, China has a wide variety of theater-based nuclear weapons. So these are nuclear weapons on shorter and intermediate range missiles that could reach U.S. bases, U.S. allies, U.S. forces in the region.
And these shorter and intermediate range missiles are absolutely critical, starting with one that's even been nicknamed after a US territory in the Pacific that comes within its range of around 4,000 kilometers.
China has, in the last decade or so, deployed the DF-26 intermediate range missile. Some people have called it the Guam killer. That missile really can't hit the continental United States, but it could hit US forces in places like Japan, Guam, throughout the Western Pacific.
The DF-26 comes in a number of variants and has another crucial feature. It can carry either nuclear or conventional warheads. That's called dual capable in the jargon, and the DF-26 is thought to be more flexible than most.
Some have questioned whether this is what we might call hot swappable, which is the idea that they can very quickly shift from a nuclear to a conventional role, or vice versa.
This sounds like a technical detail, but it matters because it could cause dangerous uncertainty, especially in a crisis. James Acton is a nuclear weapons expert based in Washington, D.C.
What worries me primarily is, say China disperses a bunch of conventional DF-26s. We may wrongly think that they're nuclear armed. And so we may think that China is signaling its intention to use nuclear weapons where in fact it's not doing so. That could drive up tensions in the crisis.
The DF-17 is also said to be dual capable. It's classified as medium range, reaching up to about 2,500 kilometers. The DF-17 took pride of place at Beijing's last major parade in 2019 as its first hypersonic system, showing China was at the cutting edge of this technology, where the front section detaches and glides at hypersonic speed to its target. But even more crucial is their agility.
Instead of just following a simple arc, which is what a typical ballistic missile will follow, these different types of hypersonic vehicles are able to first fly at very high speeds, but they're also able to maneuver in different ways that makes it harder for missile defenses to track and hit them.
Another key system is the DF-21, with a range of up to around 2,000 kilometers. It's also dual capable and comes in variants to hit land targets or ships. Beneath these layers of medium and intermediate range missiles are more shorter range ballistic and cruise missiles, some from earlier generations.
Across the board, they have one of the most advanced missile arsenals in the world, conventional and nuclear.
We haven't covered every missile here, but we've seen a picture emerge of a much more robust nuclear force than China has ever had before. With a full nuclear triad, technologies like MIRVs and hypersonics to evade missile defenses, and dual-capable designs for flexibility. So while the Chinese might not have as many warheads as the US, they now have a highly advanced arsenal of nuclear-capable missiles. This is the Chinese system eating away at America's dominance.
It's a real strength of theirs, I think, both of their industrial base, their ability to produce and develop them, but also increasingly their ability to kind of deploy them across a wide range of systems.
But how might Beijing actually use all these weapons? What are they for? Time now to get our heads around the idea of nuclear doctrine and how China's may be changing.
Внимание, расчет, пуск. Есть пуск.
February 19th, 2022, northern Russia. A test launch of Russia's Yars ICBM. It's a nuclear flex just before Russia invades Ukraine. On the ground, the invasion does not go well, and on February 27th, Vladimir Putin meets with his military leadership.
приказываю министру обороны и начальнику генерального штаба перевести силы сдерживания российской армии в особый режим несения боевого дежурства.
The deterrence forces, that means nuclear. This was Vladimir Putin's first nuclear threat in his war against Ukraine. It wouldn't be his last. Putin has at least implicitly threatened to use nuclear weapons several times since then. The primary goal, preventing the West from directly intervening. And it seems to have worked. Both Joe Biden and Donald Trump expressed fears of nuclear war and set limits on US support for Ukraine. And that did not go unnoticed in Beijing.
So as a Chinese, when I look at the war in Ukraine, I have to consider the fact that Russia's senior world threats about using nuclear warheads have actually worked. And so that is why not a single soldier from NATO was sent to fight on the ground of Ukraine.
I think China has been learning from Vladimir Putin how to play the nuclear card, how to scare basically the out of the Western countries with nuclear threats, and how to potentially use this capability of getting a free hand with whatever, military, adventurism may exist in Beijing. And of course, Taiwan is the first and that comes to mind.
Xi Jinping has explicitly said he reserves the right to seize democratic Taiwan by force. China's military exercises around the island have become ever more ambitious, and US military leaders are sounding the alarm.
China's increasingly aggressive actions near Taiwan are not just exercises, they are rehearsals.
What if one of these rehearsals turns into the real thing? An attack on Taiwan, just like Putin attacked Ukraine?
I think China is hoping to use the same playbook and make US leaders fear that there could be a major nuclear war with China if we were to go too far in supporting Taiwan.
China's nuclear expansion could be an enabler here.
If the United States intervenes, China might not feel confident in its ability to use nuclear deterrence and make nuclear threats. On the other hand, if it has a more robust arsenal that would certainly survive a US first strike, that would not just maybe hit a couple of cities in the United States, but annihilate the United States, then I think China would be much more comfortable with that nuclear backstop, more confident in its ability to aggress against its neighbors and deter US intervention.
This is where we run into the first big question about China's philosophy of nuclear weapons, its doctrine. Would China make nuclear threats like Russia has? Joe Bo says the answer is a clear no.
China, on the contrary, has never threatened to use nuclear weapons. Instead, China's most time-honored defense policy has been no first use of nuclear weapons.
The no first use policy goes back to the early days of China's nuclear program.
So no first use results from the Chinese leaders' decision that they only needed nuclear weapons to deter nuclear attack. So for that limited military goal, no first use allowed China to maintain a very small arsenal.
For the poor and isolated China of Mao Zedong, there were clear benefits to this approach.
So China was able to not spend too much resource into its nuclear weapon program, and that also bolstered China's international image as a more modest and self-restrained nuclear power.
China's neighbor and rival India went nuclear with an underground test in the late 90s and adopted a similar policy. But of course, it's one thing to have a policy. The question is, can anyone still believe it? Manpreet Sethi is a nuclear weapons expert based in Delhi. We spoke to her in Berlin.
So India and China are the only two countries that have a no first use agreement, no first use doctrine. And there are always concerns raised on the credibility of a no first use because these are declaratory statements. These are not verifiable.
So does China have credibility? That depends on your view of this man and the system he leads.
Xi Jinping also says that he's a big proponent of democracy as he locks up 1 million Muslim Uyghurs in concentration camps. So you can't really believe anything that they say. And same thing with the no first use policy.
Others add that China's surging capabilities cast further doubt on no first use. Are all those advanced missiles we saw at the Beijing parade really consistent with a doctrine based on the conditions of decades ago?
I think your seriousness of the commitment to no first use largely comes from your force posture and your force structure. With the capability changes that are happening in China today, there is a concern that it might, on the ground, be abandoning no first use. So declaratory positions will not change, in my understanding, but things are changing on the ground, which will be a matter of concern.
And the deeper you dig into this idea of no first use, the more the questions mount up.
The no first use policy is actually more complicated than it may sound. The military has studied scenarios and made plans for scenarios in which so-called strategic conventional targets in China are under threat from enemy's conventional weapons. And in these scenarios, the military has plans to threaten nuclear first use. So this is very similar to Russia's nuclear signaling strategy in the Ukraine war.
But wouldn't threatening to use nuclear weapons first contradict China's no first use policy as a simple matter of logic?
Their thinking is, as long as China didn't end up following through the nuclear threats, as long as China didn't eventually use nuclear weapons, then China didn't violate its no first use, right? So that's why it's perceived by many foreign countries as not very credible. There are major loopholes in this policy.
And there's another technical loophole beginning to appear. This one isn't about threats, it's about detecting incoming missiles and being ready to respond before they land.
Looking at the capabilities China is building, it is very clear that China is building a very capable and a comprehensive strategic early warning system that can, detect missiles and aircraft thousands of kilometers outside Chinese territory.
The US and Russia have long established early warning systems. China is said to be getting technological help with this from Russia. The questions here center on what you do if you get an early warning that a nuclear missile is incoming. China is thought to be developing a capability known as launch under attack, which enables you to fire back immediately before that incoming missile lands. That might sound good, but it makes potential false alarms extremely dangerous.
The problem, I think, is in a crisis, and particularly a conventional war, and particularly a limited nuclear war. In those contingencies, particularly a limited nuclear war, everybody would be on edge in a way that's unimaginable in peacetime. Your early warning system would almost certainly be degraded to some extent. You would be seeing missiles, rockets fired left, right, and center. You would be much more inclined to interpret something ambiguous as a nuclear attack. At that point, the possibility that some kind of misinterpreted warning or false warning could lead to a nuclear strike is something that I believe is very much in the realm of the imaginable.
This could be doubly risky when looking at a setup like China's, whose land-based silos remain the core of its nuclear forces.
Silos by themselves are not very survivable. The United States could very easily wipe out Chinese silos with its highly accurate ICBMs. Silos plus launch under attack together is a very dangerous combination.
The danger lies in the incentives this creates to fire back immediately, even if you're not 100% sure. It blurs no first use, and it puts nuclear forces on a hair trigger.
I wish it was something China wasn't doing. I don't support launch under attack in the United States. but it's a way of guaranteeing or trying to guarantee that those missiles get off the ground before they're destroyed.
But let's pick up for a moment on something else that James Acton said just a minute ago.
Limited nuclear war.
What is limited nuclear war? Is it something that China is also preparing for? And is there a way to keep it limited? The signals are here at the parade, in the potential roles of those intermediate and medium-range missiles that we saw in Part 2. James Acton breaks it down.
Its build-up of its regional nuclear forces clearly indicates it's thinking much more about this contingency, that it's trying to match the United States in a limited nuclear war. But note that that's consistent with two possibilities. Maybe China's thinking about using nuclear weapons first in the region. Maybe China just wants the ability to respond tit for tat to the United States. We don't really know, but the fact that China's thinking a lot more about regional nuclear wars is a significant change.
In Beijing, Zhou Bo acknowledges that this is happening. He sets out a scenario in which it's the US using nuclear weapons first.
We have to be prepared, for the for the worst scenario of the United States deciding to use nuclear weapons in Taiwan Strait. More and more people are talking about how the U.S. military might actually lose to the Chinese military in a war across the strait. Because the Chinese military certainly would enjoy a lot of advantages, because of the geographical proximity, right? Basically, we're fighting on a home turf. So that, of course, is the most dangerous scenarios for which we have to be prepared.
But whoever goes nuclear first, wouldn't a limited nuclear war inevitably spin way out of control?
Nuclear war is a spectrum, a continuum. You can imagine the first use of nuclear weapons being against an aircraft carrier at sea. A single nuke detonated against an aircraft carrier, it destroys the ship and kills everybody on it. In that case, a nuclear weapon might not lead to any collateral damage, and it would be against an obvious, legitimate military target. At the other end of the spectrum is a mass orgy of killing, in which nuclear weapons are used against civilian targets, against cities, leading to the deaths of hundreds of millions of people immediately, and long-term climactic effects that would kill billions afterwards.
So how might Chinese planners be thinking about this? About keeping any nuclear conflict below the level of Armageddon?
What I suspect is changing is that as China thinks about regional nuclear war, it thinks about targeting things like American military bases, Japanese military bases in Japan, military targets in places like Guam, Hawaii, and Alaska.
Remember the Guam killer at the Beijing parade? The DF-26 intermediate range missile. It's ideal for this kind of scenario.
I imagine that China's thinking about a whole bunch of new targets at lower ends of the escalation ladder. That it thinks would be useful for trying to gain leverage over the United States, for trying to terrify the United States, but not enrage the United States so much that it led to all-out nuclear war.
It's hard to even think about these scenarios, but China's nuclear breakout is so fast, so comprehensive, and so loaded with world-changing ambition that other powers cannot ignore it. In fact, Beijing's actions are already kicking off reactions by the US and others that could also change the world. So in our next video, we'll dive into those actions and reactions, and how to prevent them leading to disaster.